This is Robert Kaplan from the Foreign Policy Research Institute in Philadelphia. This is a podcast series about great power rivalry in an age of global demons.
If Russia continues to interfere with our democracy, I'm prepared to take further actions to respond.
Cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion.
The United States does not have the qualification to say that it wants to speak to China from a position of strength.
How will conflicts between the United States and China and between the United States and Russia interact with pandemics, climate change, massive cyber attacks, state failures, and other terrors of a global media age? Stay tuned for a giveaway of my most recent book, The Good American, The Epic Life of Bob Gersony, the U.S. government's greatest humanitarian. With me is Bruno Maçães, one of the most brilliant thinkers today dealing with everything connected with China. He's published a number of path-breaking books on the subject, and he has been based in China, so he really knows his subject, different from many people in North America who pontificate on China, but don't know as much as Bruno knows. Bruno, welcome.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Let me start this way. Everyone's talking about the Belt and Road Initiative. What is it about the Belt and Road Initiative that, in your opinion, few people in Washington appreciate? That when you go to America, you find all these misconceptions, or maybe they're not misconceptions. You know, what is the difference between the real Belt and Road and how people are talking about it?
Right. I think there are a lot of misconceptions. The main one that I find all over the place, but particularly bad in North America, is the idea that the Belt and Road is about physical infrastructure. I actually puzzle sometimes about why it became so implanted in people's minds that this was the purpose of the initiative. It's there, of course, but even in the original speech that Xi Jinping gave in 2013, it's only one pillar of the initiative and not the most important one. The idea that China wants to reshape the global economy, that the initiative is about industry, that the initiative is about trade, and above everything else, that the initiative is about technology and technological power. I find that very difficult to make that point. So recently, the Financial Times, based on a study coming out of Boston University, argued that the Belt and Road was over. Why? Because investment in infrastructure was falling a bit during a pandemic. Whereas, in fact, China has made some stride during 2020, signing important trade deals. But the idea that it's about infrastructure is so dominant that it's difficult to convince people that it's much broader than that.
Anything else? Because what you hear often in Washington is, well, they've driven the Sri Lankans into debt. Therefore, Hambantota is a failure. That to me is a very one-dimensional way of looking.
Right. It's odd that became so ingrained. Of course, it's about political influence. But by the way, political influence doesn't work like that. That's a very legalistic way of looking at it. Political influence works through promising people, sometimes officials, that they will get lots of money in the future, they will have nice projects, they will win elections, and sometimes the money will go straight into their bank accounts. It's about projecting Chinese power. It's about projecting an image of prestige, an image of technological advancement. So, of course, the Belt and Road is about projecting Chinese influence, but not through this, as you say, limited dimension of just loans. That, by the way, has gotten China in some trouble in some cases, and it's going to be difficult to recover some of the investment. So very obviously, the way Chinese influence works is through other channels, and we see that every day, in fact, happening.
When I look at Belt and Road, what I see is kind of like China's a little bit like the British East India Company, except going in the opposite direction, from east to west rather than from west to east. And it's wrong to look at some of these big projects in purely financial terms. There's mercantile, geopolitical, imperial elements to it that don't show up on the accountant's record book, so to speak. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And it's a comparison that is made quite often in Pakistan, by the way, where a question I got When lecturing in Pakistan on the Belt and Road, I got the question all the time, is this a new East India Company? Obviously, in Pakistan, that's a delicate topic,
Yeah.
and the comparison is made explicitly. You're right. It's about all those dimensions. And let us not forget culture as well. So to go back to my time in Pakistan, just before the pandemic started, I was there for a month and planning to go back for another month or two, but it wasn't possible anymore. But what struck me was also the level of cultural, let us call it, penetration that China is achieving there. You walk on the street, particularly in Lahore, the street signs you see about language schools, they're now more often about Chinese than about, let us say, the European languages, which no one cares about anymore, or English for those who would only be Urdu speakers. It's very common to find Mandarin speakers in Pakistan now. You talk to young people, and spontaneously what comes up in conversation is the year they spent in China, or the year they want to spend in China, or their dreams of being accepted at Tsinghua. It's become, as you know very well, almost impossible for a Pakistani to dream of going to an American university. Even if he or she gets accepted, the problems with the visas are almost unsurmountable, and the university is not going to be able to help. So that's helped shift the whole cultural universe of Pakistan, but of many other countries, towards Beijing. And when they visit and when they see the modernity of Chinese society, they are attracted and fascinated by that. So the cultural element also very important.
Yes, I know the United States spent billions in Pakistan, mainly fighting the war on terror, and it didn't get anything for it, essentially. And whenever I'm in China or elsewhere in East Asia, and I come back to Kennedy Airport in the United States, it's like I'm entering a third world country. You know, there's this modernity, it's almost to a level of an ideology, I find, in East Asia. I can't quite put my finger on it, but it's this cutting edge modernity.
Technology is the leading ideology. By the way, not entirely surprising. What is the ideology in Marxism? It really is technology, the means of production, changes in the means of production. That's the fundamental driver of history that then leads to changes in the relations of production. So Chinese in this are quite Marxist in the original meaning of the words. They focus on technology, and they think that the root of global power is in technology. So the discussion now is about how to move to the heights of technological power. But they are quite aware. I believe they were very aware before the Huawei saga. But obviously, if you had any doubts, it became clear that this is a deeply geopolitical process, and it's not through market forces. So if anyone was so naive as to think that Chinese companies would rise to the top through better product, they now realize that the issue is more complicated. It's about power, and that's where the Belt and Road comes in, as an exercise of national power towards technological advancement.
We're going to take a short break, and when we return, Bruno and I will discuss the geography of Asia from a true insider's perspective. Stay tuned.
This podcast is sponsored by the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. Founded in 1955, FPRI is committed to producing the highest quality scholarship and expert analysis through the lens of history, geography, and culture. For more information about FPRI and our work to educate the public on the most pressing foreign policy issues of the day, please visit www.fpri.org.
Let's move a little bit to geography. When I was younger, I'm 68 now. When I was much younger and you said the word Eurasia, people knew what it meant. It was the supercontinent. But it had no meaning beyond that. It was too big. There was almost an abstraction about it. It didn't lead to a conversation of any kind. Now, as the world becomes more claustrophobic and smaller, like geography is not disappearing, but it is shrinking, Eurasia seems to have a meaning that it didn't have before. What's your take on that?
I think you agree with me that this is an important word that we'll hear more about in coming years and coming decades as the borders between West and East in Eurasia break down, between Europe and Asia break down. And these borders have been in place, this wall of separation has been in place for many centuries in some form or another. European colonialism was not able to break that. So the fact that we now have societies on both sides of that wall of separation that are equally developed, equally technological, that they are trying to find a new way of living together. This is really the open question in geopolitics today, because we know that the United States is going to be a very powerful for the next 50 years. We know that China is going to be a very powerful country, and we know that they're not going to get along. The questions are the questions having to do with Eurasia. What is going to be the relationship between China and Russia? Truly unpredictable. Between Europe and China, unpredictable. Between Europe and Russia and India, how these pieces fit together. And of course, how America is going to be able to influence that process. American decision makers have to decide what is the shape of Eurasia that they would prefer and what is the worst case scenario. And Europeans are thinking the same. But these are really the open questions that are going to decide the future. And so in that sense, the future is Eurasian, because the other two main axes, Trans-Pacific and Transatlantic, are much more consolidated, and there's going to be much less turmoil and much less unpredictability happening there. That's how I see the question of Eurasia, really an open question, not a decided one. In my book on Eurasia, I obviously do not take the view that Eurasia is going to be unified. That's one scenario, one of the most unlikely, by the way, but it's one scenario, but it's an open question. It's a question mark, really.
Yeah, and somewhat key in this are the former Soviet Central Asian republics, where both China and Russia have equities. Russian is still the lingua franca in former Soviet Central Asia, and probably will be for some time. Kind of like English is in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, kind of. It's like the only language people can agree on between them. And that's an inherent advantage, especially in intelligence gathering. Whereas China has more money. So Central Asia is not all of what's in between East Asia and Europe, but it is a big part of it.
Yes, we forgot to mention Turkey, which is also an important actor. Just last week, it caught some people's attention that the Kyrgyz and Uzbek presidents met, and they spoke in their national language, which are perfectly intelligible to each other. A Portuguese and a Spanish prime ministers would meet, and they would speak in their languages, and not Russian, as they used to do. That was interesting, and I don't know the exact reason that happened. It may well be the case that the new Kyrgyz president is not as comfortable in Russian as the older generation. It's possible. So there's a process which is happening by which Russia is losing influence. The Turkey culture is coming to the surface. It's now been 30 years since the end of the Soviet Union. China is very present. Europe is not entirely absent. So it's a part of the world that is subject to so many different influences. We're all still waiting. I don't know if it's for our lifetimes or not, also for India to become an important player. In Afghanistan, it already is. In other parts of Central Asia, I think it will have to wait. But clearly fascinating to both of us, I think, precisely because it is subject to all these influences. And Turkey, not irrelevant at all in coming decades.
India is sort of the semi-tropical geopolitical island on its own, kind of hemmed in by mountain ranges, the Himalayas, the Karakorums, and by the Burmese jungles to the east, so to speak. And, India is one of these countries that's always underperformed, that hasn't kind of broken out of its own self-created bureaucratic straitjacket. But given that India has a prime minister now, for all his flaws, does have a real geopolitical mindset that previous Indian prime ministers did not have. I suppose we can expect that little by little, India will play a greater role as the years go on. Let me turn for a minute to Europe. Henry Kissinger said to me that if Europe doesn't watch out, if it doesn't get its act together and unify, it will just be a Western appendage of Eurasia. They'll call it the subcontinent, the way we call India a subcontinent. The future of Europe may not be cataclysmic. It may not be brilliant. It may just be less important than it has been in the early modern and modern centuries.
Yes, that was another reason I was interested in the idea of Eurasia that you write about a lot in your book on Marco Polo's world. The idea that Europe may well disappear. Continents are not static, and we may slowly, this is a process that will take a century, but we may slowly come to think of Europe as part of Eurasia, as being absorbed by Eurasia, which it once was. So it would be a return to that past. Europe emerged as something different, something special and unique out of Eurasia. And it was its modern scientific Enlightenment civilization that was able to do this. It wasn't the Greeks. And that could disappear. It's certainly a possible or even a plausible scenario over the long term that Chinese economic power and Chinese economic presence is going to be impossible to resist. But even today, not thinking about 100 years from now, but even today, all major questions being discussed in Europe have to do with forces coming from the East. Could be the refugees crisis, could be Ukraine and Russia, could be Turkey, which has become an obsessive question, particularly in Paris. So we see that Europe now is struggling with this old concept that it is isolated from the rest of Eurasia. The forces are now so powerful that they break through very easily. So I think, in fact, if we want to be rigorous about geography, perhaps it's already time to talk about Eurasia. Where do you find this distinction when everything coming from the East so easily enters Europe, influences politics, influences business? Ministers lose their jobs because of a polemic involving China, Russia, or Turkey all the time. Isn't this part of Eurasia? Can you actually think about Europe without thinking about China, Russia, Turkey in particular, the Muslim world? I don't think so. Not anymore.
We're going to take a short break. Stay tuned.
If you're enjoying the Global Demons podcast, you'll also enjoy Robert D. Kaplan's latest book, The Good American, a sweeping yet intimate story of the most influential humanitarian you've never heard of, Bob Gersony, who spent 4 decades in crisis zones around the world. Thanks to our sponsor, Random House, you can win a signed copy of The Good American just by listening to this podcast. All you have to do is subscribe to this podcast and leave a review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. We will have a random drawing and announce the winner on our 13th and final episode.
If you look at the history of Europe, just the Slavic migrations in the Dark Ages that recreated and remade Europe. I mean, from Serbia and Macedonia, this was in Bulgaria, this was all Slavic migrations that came from Inner Asia. There was a great American historian, Henry Adams, the grandson of John Quincy Adams, who wrote that, that Europe's whole past and future turns on how it can handle the Russia problem. Not just Hitler and Napoleon. Well, Hitler wasn't alive then. He wasn't there. But Henry Adams was talking about it's always all about Russia. And Russia is too big, is a bridge too far for Europe to control, so to speak. So you have Russia, you have the Slavic migrations. You have also the Byzantine Empire, which had territory in the East. All of this influenced Europe and made Europe what it became. I mean, Europe would not have been Europe in the Middle Ages without the Arab takeover of North Africa, which separated Europe from the southern shore of the Mediterranean so much. Well, we could go on and on about this. Let me turn for a second to the Middle East. All right, Americans have this idea, the Middle East, that's all about forever wars, which we want to forget about, and we want to downplay the Middle East. Meanwhile, China is everywhere in the Middle East. I mean, it seems to be making Egypt its hub, so to speak. It's heavily invested in Saudi Arabia and Iran, all over. What are China's designs in the Middle East? I see it as kind of a way to connect Europe and Eurasia and East Asia as part of Belt and Road.
Yes, that's certainly part of it. We see that all over the Middle East and the larger Middle East, which could go all the way to the Horn of Africa, could go all the way to Iran. We see that China is very focused on the critical sea transport infrastructure. This will open many possibilities for China, both to make money, but also to, in a way, influence and shape global value chain and have enormous leverage over countries and industries. To give a very crude example, if a company somehow displeases Beijing, perhaps its access to a terminal in a major port becomes more difficult, or the contract is not renewed. I sense that sometimes people are not entirely aware that this leverage is being built, and then it will be used. It will be used without even making it to the newspapers, but it will be used. It's also about oil, energy that China continues to be quite dependent on, more than the United States now. It's also about a very young part of the world and very entrepreneurial. There really isn't this awareness in the US. There's a venture capitalist, but also an author, Christopher Schroeder, that you may know. He has a book on entrepreneurship in the Middle East that I recommend for people to change a bit their idea of the region. Obama famously told Jeffrey Goldberg in that interview on the Obama doctrine that as opposed to Southeast Asia, that people in the Middle East only wanted to kill Americans rather than to make money. But that's obviously not the reality. There's an entrepreneurial energy, and a country like Egypt is going to be an important economy. China is very realistic. It knows that its influence is not going to go directly to the current centers of global power. There are intermediate regions that will be important because of the size, because of the youth, because the sheer size of the Egyptian market is important, even if it's not a wealthy country. And so they're very realistic about this and don't obsess about Germany all the time and look at other parts of the world.
Yes. It looks like the Chinese in the future will be administering the ports of Haifa and Ashdod in Israel and in Alexandria in Egypt. Now think about that, the Chinese running these ports of these two countries that used to be hostile to each other and fought wars. A larger issue, does history have a direction? I mean, I wrote recently that America is all obsessed with ideas of democracy and freedom, and that history has a direction towards progress, towards liberal progress. The Chinese seem curiously, they're not ideological. Yes, they have a severe authoritarian regime. They seem to think that it's all about trade and business. And that begs the question, does history have a direction? Maybe it doesn't.
I don't think it does. I'm a subscriber to the view that you have periods where ideas are dominant, but then other ideas become dominant. You can call it new civilizations, new ways of looking at the world. Looking at history, that's what's always happened. And ideas are important. They are at the core of these civilizational units. But somehow the human spirit is never at rest and never gets convinced that it's found the truth for good reasons. Why should it be at rest? And therefore, you're always going to find the effort to find new ways to do things. China does this as well in a very intuitive, pragmatic way. But you have the Chinese ideologues at the universities in particular that try to give it a certain shape. I don't think that's so different from what happened when the West was built centuries ago. On the one hand, you have very practical people making money, exercising power, and then you have people on the side, which often don't come at the beginning. They try to give a certain shape and order to developments that already happen on the ground. And China is doing this. It's trying to create a different political model, picks up some pieces from the past, but this is not going to be Confucianism. This is going to be a post-liberal way of looking at the state and a society, not a pre-liberal one. What shape exactly it will take is still too early. There's an emphasis on state capacity. We saw that during the pandemic. This has become important for the way Chinese organize their ideology, let us call it. And there's an emphasis on technology and not being afraid of the changes brought about by technology. Many people are busy trying to put these pieces together, but obviously we still don't have a John Locke of the new Chinese political model. But I suspect we will have one eventually.
Yes, a colleague of ours, Parag Khanna, has said there is an Asian system developing that's more than just China. It includes Southeast Asia, how Asians trade with each other more than with the outside. And in this Asian system, its features, its general features are, it could be like, state capitalism, a technocracy, a kind of raising technology to almost an ideological level, and yet mixed in with a socially conservative worldview. That Asians want no part of the cancel culture in the United States, neither do the French for that matter, it seems. But that a strong socially conservative point of view is, merging with technocracy to form a kind of Asian system.
Yes, I essentially agree with this way of looking at things. The debate on democracy and authoritarianism is very important, but it's only one dimension. There are other dimensions, a cultural one. I mean, if we think back to the history of European modern political societies, you had authoritarian societies, Imperial Germany, you had radically democratic ones, some periods in France, you had aristocratic, liberal, but still non-democratic regimes. They still shared a certain European way of looking at the world, which had to do with the Enlightenment, which was shared even between autocracies and democracies, had to do with science, had to do with race, had to do with religion, with many things. And today in Asia, I think Parag is right that even countries that are fiercely democratic, they have a way of looking at the world that has a lot in common with the way the Chinese look at the world, and they understand China. So often the loyalties are different and a bit unpredictable. On many questions, they will be very anti-Chinese, but then on other questions, they will feel themselves on the side of China. And they will say things like in South Korea, they will say things like, we understand each other and we don't understand Europeans or Americans. As often we've said in this conversation, things are a bit more complicated than the single variable analysis that you sometimes find.
Final question. You wrote in your Eurasia book, or your Belt and Road book, about a certain opacity in the way that the Chinese do things, that it's not going to be a world of rules and regulations and transparency, but things will happen. And it will be unclear why they happened as they did. I suppose you meant kind of backroom maneuvering and kind of understandings that are not written down in the way that Belt and Road will progress.
Yes, that is a big difference to the way we look at things in the West. That is something that should worry us and should disturb us. We're not going to be comfortable in that world. I think the Chinese in general are. And the example I give in my book is Pakistan, where you really have to penetrate almost different levels of clearance. I think this is how the Belt and Road works. There are different levels of clearance, and some managers have access to things that are not on the newspapers, but it's still not the highest level of clearance. In Pakistan, I talk about this in my book. I was lucky to have access to a report that is not public on what the Belt and Road is supposed to be in Pakistan. It's quite remarkable in this day and age. Usually, if you search long enough, you find everything on the internet. It might not be in the obvious side, but it's somewhere. This is not on the internet at all. No one has leaked it. And it's the report where the Belt and Road in Pakistan is described. Now, I suspect this report, which is at least printed, it's not even the deepest level of clearance. It goes deeper into things that are happening in private meetings. Doesn't mean that this doesn't happen in Western societies, of course, but we don't see it as a value. We see it as something that has to be reduced as much as possible. Whereas in this world of the Belt and Road, another comparison I use is with the Templar Order or the Templars. There is something of that. I always find that the best analogy to the Chinese Communist Party that we can find in Western history is the Order of the Templars. That's how they work and how they operate. I'll
have to read up more on my Crusader history, my post-Crusader history in the Eastern Mediterranean. Well, Bruno Maçães, thank you so much for your time. This has been truly excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Global Demons podcast. brought to you by the Foreign Policy Research Institute. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts and visit our website at www.fpri.org. For the Foreign Policy Research Institute, I'm Robert D. Kaplan.